My name is Nicole Bijlsma. I'm a building biologist and I began the building biology industry exactly 20 years ago to this month. I moved into Warrandyte many years ago, and the moment we moved in, my husband and I developed insomnia. I subsequently had 10 miscarriages and no one was able to assist as to why I had so many miscarriages. We went everywhere, recurrent miscarriage clinic everywhere. And lo and behold, I noticed that we were sleeping in the meter panel, and as I started to look at the data, I realised that there was a handful of research on the impact of exposure to magnetic fields and miscarriage risk. So I said to my husband, I think this room is a problem. It's near traffic-related air pollutants because we're at the T intersection near Research Warrandyte Road. We need to move out of the room. So we did, and had our children successfully. At the same time, I was working as a naturopath acupuncturist for 15 years, and many of my patients with chronic fatigue syndrome would be talking about the visible mould in their home, and also if they were sleeping near meter panels, etc., or if I thought that would be an issue. And I had studied acupuncture, traditional Chinese medicine, as well as naturopathy, and spent 8 years at university, and did not get trained in the environment at all. So as a result of moving into our lovely home in Warrandyte, everything changed for me, and I started to investigate the impact of the environment on human health. And what I discovered was that there was so much evidence for the impact of traffic-related air pollutants and electromagnetic fields at that time that I realised that this was a really important area that clinicians needed to learn about, and as a result of that I established the Australian College of Environmental Studies in June 1999. In 2005 it became a registered training organisation, and since then we've provided the only nationally accredited course in electromagnetic field testing, mould testing, air sampling, etc., etc. So the building biologists come through my college and they're spreading out throughout Australia to educate people how our homes are contributing to most chronic illnesses. Now, when it comes to electromagnetic fields, the first thing people need to get a gist of is that the exposure standards are not health-based standards. They're actually developed in compromise with the industry to determine what's practicable in a workplace for a 100-kilo US soldier based in 1998. So there are no exposure standards for long-term exposure to low levels typically found in the built environment, in our schools, in our homes, etc. And as a result of that, the argument that our PANSA, who are our regulatory body, Australian Radiation Protection and Nuclear Safety Authority, who hide behind the ICNIRP standards, International Commission for Non-Ionising Radiation Protection, develop standards based on short-term heating effects of up to 6-minute increments. So that is for a workplace. It's based on the fact that it has to heat your brain, heat your body, before it can have adverse health effects. Now we know there has been a plethora of research, thousands of studies now, that have shown very clearly how electromagnetic fields, and in particular radio frequencies, can impact the body at a cellular level. Research conducted by Professor Martin Paul in the US has shown very conclusively that electromagnetic fields at low levels can impact voltage-gated calcium channels, which then allow the influx of calcium into the cell, and that can result in 2 downstream effects. One, it can result in healing effects because as a result of the free radicals created within the cell and the damage to the mitochondria, it can result in an increase in antioxidants, catalase, peroxidase, glutathione peroxidase, for example. So if there are more antioxidants created in your cell as a result of the exposure to stress, electromagnetic fields, it has a positive effect. However, when you have long-term exposure to low levels, such as using your cell phone, exposures to near fields for wireless technology, it results in long-term free radical production, and eventually your antioxidant systems are overwhelmed, and as a result of this it can result in cell dysfunction and eventually cell death. And of course we now know in research that free radicals and oxidative stress are married with low-grade inflammation. Now, ageing is oxidative stress and inflammation. EMFs cause oxidative stress and inflammation. So does mould, stress, lifestyle changes, too much exercise. If we were to really simplify illness and chronic illnesses and ageing, it would be an increase in oxidative stress and low-grade inflammation long-term that results in ageing, etc. So what has become clear is we know the mechanism by which electromagnetic fields may impact the body at a cellular level. In some people, however, genetically susceptible, they can result in symptoms quicker than most of us. We are all impacted by electromagnetic fields, and what is clear from the research as a result of the translation from the Germans 3 years ago, from the Russian research of 3 decades, is that these symptoms occur over a very long period of time. It's very rare to have symptoms develop immediately unless you're electrically sensitive, in which case you'll develop headaches, which is common in children, especially exposures to wireless technology, fatigue, abdominal-related disorders in children, because that's how they can express migraine headaches, for example, palpitations, chest restrictions, and of course the big one for EMFs is generally insomnia and sleep-related disorders. From my experience as a building biologist, if people are sleeping in the near field, which means, if, for example, if they have a router on their desk and they are within 4 wavelengths of that frequency, their symptoms develop much more quickly into electromagnetic sensitivities. So people sleeping near smart meters, near especially routers, cordless phones within the near field, which is about 52 centimetres from a 2.4 gigahertz source. However, many of us will find over a long period of time that our ability to deal with cancers is significantly compromised, because one mechanism by which electromagnetic fields may impact the body is to suppress the most important anti-cancer neurotransmitter you have, which is melatonin. Now, melatonin is very quickly suppressed from the blue light and the LEDs from all your digital devices. So it's critical that children after sunset do not have their digital devices, because of the fact that the blue light suppresses melatonin very quickly, which means it impacts their sleep. And of course, what we know about melatonin is that it's very closely linked to fertility and to preventing illnesses within the body, because it's the most important anti-cancer hormone antioxidant we have. It makes turmeric look like it's not doing anything. So the most important thing we need to do is sleep, and if we don't sleep, it has incredible downstream effects to all of our health, especially our immune response. And in fact, when melatonin drops, it's highest when we're youngest, but when it drops, that's the instigation for puberty. So 4 years ago, I bought a book on melatonin. It was 400 pages long. It only cost me $250. And it was the leading researchers on the impact of melatonin on the human health, and it is enormous. The third mechanism by which electromagnetic fields, and especially wireless technology, may impact human health is to enhance the permeability of the blood-brain barrier. What does that mean? It means that when you're using a cell phone close to your head for at least 30 minutes a day for 10 years, your incidence of brain tumours increases 270%, according to Professor Leonard Hardell from the Karolinska Institute in Sweden. He's the leading researcher who has been warning us for more than 2 decades about the impact of cell phones on rodent health especially. But by increasing the permeability of the blood-brain barrier and the tight junctions, what that means is that the exposure of the body to the chemicals already in our bodies, to the dampness and the mould that exist in at least 60 to 70% of the housing stock is increased. It gets a free influx into the central nervous system. So many of the patients or clients we see as building biologists have mould exposure because dampness is so incredibly prevalent as a result of changes that happened 30 years ago in Australia, deregulation of the TAFE system, waterproof membranes that only last 7 years. Can you imagine doing a bathroom reno every 7 years? Because your waterproof membrane service life only lasts 5 to 7 years. After that, moisture gets in, mould grows. So the exposure to the mould, the increase in chemicals that each generation is pre-polluted with, now gets free entry into the central nervous system, because their exposure to wireless technology is enhancing and allowing these biotoxins and chemicals to get into the central nervous system. This is why the symptoms of electromagnetic sensitivity are almost identical to chemical sensitivity, and patients with multiple chemical sensitivity, most of them, at least 70% of them, are electrically sensitive, and the sensitivities of mould and mould illnesses are also almost the same as electromagnetic fields. So when one person becomes sensitive to chemicals or mould or EMFs, they become sensitive more often than not to all of them, because the EMFs have this synergistic effect which seems to have devastating impacts on human health. If we were to look at what's happened since the World War II and the introduction of the chemical industry, we now have over 145 million chemicals registered for use on the world's largest database, the Chemical Abstract Service. Every 60 seconds, another 20 chemicals are registered on this service, which equates to around 200,000 new chemicals every single week. We know each generation is pre-born with more and more, hundreds and hundreds of chemicals, and this correlates with the significant increase in what we can only refer to now as a pandemic in neurodegenerative disorders in children from autism and ADHD. Children who were diagnosed with autism in Australia was 4 in 10,000 in 1970. Now, depending on where you live in Australia, it's 1 in 35 in some towns between the ages of 5 and 14. These correlate with exposures to things like traffic-related air pollutants, chemicals, but the big one is the introduction since 2G in 2003 with the increase in permeability of the blood-brain barrier and allowing these chemicals, allowing these biotoxins to get free entry into the central nervous system. And I think more research is starting to come into looking at the synergistic effect of a lot of these issues. The exposure standards that have been developed are completely inadequate. As I mentioned, they're designed to be what's practicable in a workplace. As a result of this, in the late 1990s, the CSIRO developed a band of electrical engineers called the Radio Frequency Division of the CSIRO. They were commissioned by Telecom at the time before they became Telstra and Vodafone and Optus to look at the impact of wireless technology on children and particularly Australian families. In 1994, this report was published. It's called the Stan Barnett Report, and as a result of the fact that these electrical engineers voiced their concerns about the impact of the EMFs on human health, it was therefore not published because the telecommunications funded it. The Democrats got hold of it and eventually became available for public use. 2 years later, all of the electrical engineers from the Radio Frequency Division were made redundant, and the CSIRO appointed Donna Staunton, who was the head of the Tobacco Institute, to make the CSIRO more corporate friendly. As a result of this, my colleague John Maish did his PhD on this to look at how exposure standards in the telecommunications industry were developed. Now, what we find is that a lot of the funding that comes from telecommunications in electromagnetic field research, that they've appointed psychologists to oversee this research, which of course means if all you've got is a hammer, all you're looking for is a nail. Psychologists well, I really don't need to say much about that. Having a psychologist overseeing the research on electromagnetic field seems like a really dumb thing to do. And of course what they're looking for is provocation studies, where they put people who are alleged to have electromagnetic sensitivities in a room, and then they put a radio frequency device somewhere else in that building to see if they react or not. What we now know about EMFs is that the reactions are very similar to allergies. They are a delayed response. So provocation studies are completely useless when it comes to electromagnetic field exposures and understanding their impact on human health. Why? Because histamines are involved. Professor Dominique Belpomme from France is the leading researcher on chronic fatigue syndrome in the world, and he has developed biomarkers to be able to diagnose patients with electromagnetic sensitivities, and in particular chronic fatigue syndrome. And what he has found is that they have high levels of histamine, systemic histamine within their body, similar to patients with allergies. They also have very low levels of melatonin in their urine. Heart rate variability is also affected, and he's developed a whole lot of other markers to help clinicians diagnose electromagnetic sensitivities and chronic fatigue syndrome. 2012, the Austrian Medical Association, as a duty of care, educated all their doctors in Austria to be able to diagnose electromagnetic sensitivity. Now that is quite remarkable for a country to do that. They acknowledged it as a dysfunctional disability, and as a result of this educated and provided a document to be able to diagnose how to diagnose electromagnetic sensitivity effectively. So there are many progressive countries who are trying to do something about this, especially with wireless technology in schools. They include Cyprus, for example, and France, that have restricted use of wireless technology within the schools. And the reason why I mention that is because wireless technology uses what we call radio frequencies, which is what 5G will be using, except at the high end of the scale. So with 5G, it uses radio frequencies, what we call microwave radiation, which is much higher. At the moment, we know the first rollout of 5G, we will be able to still assess this because it will be under 1 gigahertz, but the telecommunications has both low, medium and high frequencies that they will be launching with time. And as a result of this, we are concerned because how are we going to measure this if they roll it out beyond 10 gigahertz, which is as far as our meters will actually pick up. So an important part for people to understand is that you need to be educated about this, because the exposure standards don't exist for long-term exposures to low levels, and as a result of this, we really need to restrict our use until the precautionary principle that we can prove that it is completely safe before it's launched into the community. The reality is that medicine is littered with missed opportunity and wasted resources because of the failure to act. And there's so many examples in history, from environmental tobacco smoke to asbestos to PVC to lead dust, where as a result of a capitalist society, we don't have any onus on manufacturers to prove it's dangerous. They can launch it, and then it takes researchers years, decades, maybe even a lifetime to prove conclusively that the onus has to be on us to prove it's dangerous, rather than the manufacturers to prove it's safe before it's launched. Unfortunately, that's the society we live in, and it is a real problem in terms of our exposures, especially when you see the correlations with Parkinson's, dementia, and of course autism and ADHD in our society. So the most important thing I can recommend is to reduce your exposures to RF as much as possible. That's why I published my book, Healthy Home, Healthy Family. There's lots of information on my website, buildingbiology.com.au, in order to get yourself a gist on how to reduce your exposures by turning off your wireless devices at home, never putting your cell phone near your body, near your person. And in fact, if you look at and read what the cell phone company is telling you when you buy these devices, is never to put it near your person, which means it's actually not fit for use, because what it's being sold for and how to use it is a contradiction. The two largest insurance companies in the world, Swiss Re and Lloyd's of London, refuse to insure the telecommunications industry because of the potential, well, we don't know why, but this potential tsunami as a result of the latency period being 15 to 25 years for brain tumours and cell phones. That hasn't yet come. The fact that we're already seeing an increase in brain tumours is already a concern, because it takes 15 to 25 years for most of these meningiomas and gliomas to develop, and we'll be at the forefront of that within 2020 to 2025. So the big thing I could say is education is important. That's why it's great to see you here. Try and reduce your exposure, and especially your children's exposure to the wireless devices as much as possible. Go hardwired connections when you can, in order to create an environment, because unlike environmental tobacco smoke, etc., once the infrastructure is there, it's going to be very difficult for us to do something about that, because we're literally talking about trillions of dollars in profit. Thank you so much.
Wow.